Hello, everyone. So, in this lecture, I want to cover one of our most polarizing presidents. This is Lyndon B. Johnson. And I find it very interesting that Lyndon B. Johnson can either be considered one of our greatest presidents, one of our greatest examples, or one of our greatest failures, right? So, I find it interesting that the same person can be considered both of them. So today we're gonna tackle his legacy. What makes him great, what makes him, in a lot of ways, a tragic presidency. So let's get started. All right. So full disclosure, I have a little bit of a soft spot on LBJ, basically because not just because he's from Texas, but because he thought he was a principal and he was a teacher at a school that is about an hour away from my city. If you know a little bit about LBJ's presidency, he's one of the presidents that has shaped modern politics the most. And I always like to think that, Laredo's backyard was very influential in our community to determine, the future of what the American politics are going to look like, right? So I have a little bit of a soft spot on them, but I'm gonna try to be as unbiased as possible, okay?
So this is a picture of Lyndon B. Johnson at the Wellhausen School in Cotulla, Texas. This was in 1928, where he was a fifth, sixth, and seventh grade teacher. He was also a principal in the school, and he always considered this to be an experience that really shaped him in the way he thought and the way that he felt that, prejudice and poverty and discrimination were some of the biggest problems in America. And this is where he got to experience it firsthand. And in the future, it's going to be a big motivator for him to pass some of the most important legislation that make the great society and that it still shapes modern politics today. And so here's a famous quote by Lyndon B. Johnson when he signed the Elementary and Secondary Act. Again, this experience in Cotula, Texas, with the Mexican American community, experiencing firsthand the difficulties in the 1960s that this community experienced, is what is going to be very important for Lyndon Johnson to form his future policies for his great society.
And so, one of the ways to understand Lyndon B. Johnson's policies is that he's a bit of a continuation of FDR. So, if you remember FDR with the New Deal, Social Security, Lyndon B. Johnson is a bit of a continuation in this idea that he wants to put the government in the driving seat, right? He feels like the government has a moral obligation to help out the people in need, right? So, the way he sees it is that in this country, the government needs to be in charge to make sure that people do not suffer from prejudice or discrimination, poverty. So he does think that it is the responsibility of the government to take action against these problems, right? Now, I know this may seem kind of sort of obvious, but back in the day, this wasn't the case, all right? It is not until FDR and the New Deal that we get this reimagination of the government. We used to have a different relationship with the government in which we were very self-reliant, self-sufficient. We didn't rely on the government too much. So FDR comes to change this idea because he's the president during the Great Depression. So he puts the government in charge of a lot of things for the benefit of the people. And Lyndon B. Johnson can be understood as kind of like a big continuation of this, right? Other presidents like Harry Truman or Eisenhower do not necessarily continue this idea of FDR, but LBJ will be the president that kind of sort of takes the idea of FDR and really run with it. And so Lyndon B. Johnson will be president, on the heels of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. As a vice president, he becomes the president, very much like John F. Kennedy. Lyndon B. Johnson is a big supporter of the civil rights movement. And I think Lyndon B. Johnson's domestic policy can be best understood through, the support of the civil rights movement, but also this comprehensive war on poverty, right? What he calls the Great Society, right? So the idea of the Great Society is that America being the beacon of the world, being the best nation of the world, we couldn't have so many people living below the poverty line, right? We couldn't have people, without access to food, without access to proper housing, right? So this great society is a big war on poverty, right? So in the 1960s, poverty meant something like, for example, not having access to indoor plumbing or not having access to electricity, or malnourishment, or not having enough clothes, right? I think there's a few anecdotes in which Lyndon B. Johnson recalls being a teacher here in Cotula, and that he says that people are very malnourished, that they don't have clothes, or that they don't have shoes sometimes. So that's what it meant to be poor in the 1960s. So for Lyndon B. Johnson, this was just not acceptable. And so I find that interesting, that the idea of living below the poverty line in the 1960s versus the idea of living below the poverty line in the modern times is very different, in large part because of Lyndon Johnson, right? So, for example, right now, even people living below the poverty line have access to, for example, housing or food stamps, or indoor plumbing. It's a thing. It's a necessity that everyone has. Electricity is the same thing. uh, so a lot of these things that poverty looks so different today is in large responsibility because of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, put this great task, this great responsibility in the government to provide for the people with these opportunities. And so Lyndon B. Johnson is responsible for over 200 pieces of legislation tied to the Great Society. The two most significant ones that are tied to the civil rights movement is basically the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And as part of the Great Society, you're also going to see something like the Food Stamp Act, Medicaid, Medicare, the idea of Head Start, and I'm personally a beneficiary of Upward Bound, right? So Upward Bound is basically the idea of providing the opportunity for higher education for people who are considered economically disadvantaged, right? So in other words, financial aid for college. Okay, so the idea is, and I find it very interesting that I this is directly a responsibility from the Great Society, right? Because when I finished high school, going to college was never kind of like a question. I knew I could go to college and I wanted to go to college, so I just went to college, right? And this is a lot of what made America, such a great nation, right? Because the idea is, money should not be an impediment if you really want to get an education, right? And that is the idea behind Upward Bound. This is another reason why I find myself to be having a little bit of a soft spot on Lyndon B. Johnson, because the way I see it, I'm a personal beneficiary of this. And not only me, but a lot of people I know. And being in higher education, I know a lot of people and not a lot of students who are personal beneficiaries of this, because money is not an impediment. You want to get an education, you get a higher education, right? And you do it, and it just is a thing that you just do, right? You just don't question. And I understand in other parts of the world is really not the case, right? You need to start thinking about it in a different way, whether you really want to, whether you really can afford to go and have higher education, right? So you could think about the same with food stamps, right? People here are not gonna go hungry. At least in the United States, people do not go hungry. All right. Access to healthcare, access to healthcare for the elderly. There's a lot of programs that are aimed at ending poverty that are basically the design of the Great Society. So the Great Society is a massive, massive overtaking. I believe it rivals FDR's New Deal in the sheer amount of legislation. And this is exactly where you're going to see the criticism toward the Great Society. Okay, because at the end of the day, I think everyone can be on board with a lot of these things. Of course, supporting people who want to go to school. You don't want people to go hungry. You want people to have access to healthcare. You want people who are elderly to have access to healthcare. You want a lot of these things that are part of the Great Society. We all can get on board with them, right? I don't know a lot of people who don't want these things, right? The criticism is twofold, right? And is very similar to the criticism we get with FDR's New Deal. Number one is the expansion of the government, right? You are basically giving all this money, all this trust to the government to do this on behalf of the people. And in the 1960s, people very much like in the 1930s are worrying about government overreach, right? Giving the government this power, expanding so much the powers of the government, and at the end of the day, how much oversight and how much trust can you put in the government. Number two is basically this is not free, and this is coming straight from the people who pay taxes. All right, so I was very careful to not use the word free healthcare or free food or free education, but rather access to these things, right? Because at the end of the day, these things are not free, right? So the main criticism from this is that yes, we all want those things, but how much is it costing the taxpayer? Because for example, you have Medicaid, right? And Medicaid initially was costing $10 billion annually. Today it's costing over $700 billion annually, right? So this is becoming something that people think it's unsustainable. All right, we cannot continue to grow this debt, ballooning the debt, and also expanding the overreach of the government. Okay, so these are the biggest criticisms that we get of the government. But more than anything, the third and most important thing coming out of the criticism from the Great Society is it creating government dependency? In other words, are the people becoming too reliable in the government to fix their problems, right? Because at the end of the day, we do want to help people in need, be it food stamps or education or access to healthcare, you name it. All right, no one's against people getting access to these things, right? The problem becomes how much are you making people reliable? All right, how much is it stunting the innovation, the American grade of go doing? All right, people become a little bit too satisfied in the way they are. And at least where I'm from, it is a very common thing of I don't want to get a better job, or I don't want to get a better paid job because I'm going to get my food stamps taken away, because I'm going to get my benefits taken away, right? So this is what people mean when they say it fosters government dependency, and also it stunts the innovation, it stunts the ambition of wanting to do more, right? So many people see this as one of the outcomes of the Great Society. I know the Great Society has a great outcome of, for example, eliminating the poverty line from 22 to 12%, but it also has the other outcome of is it creating government dependency, right? So these are some of the main criticisms coming to Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society. So, whatever your opinion is on Lyndon B. Johnson's domestic policy, through the civil rights movement, the passing of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, or the Great Society, I know it's sometimes difficult to find a balance between what the Great Society, you know, delivered versus how much it cost. It's fine, these are interesting conversations, right? I think what we all can agree with is how much a catastrophe Lyndon B. Johnson's foreign policy is going to be. And of course, I'm talking about the escalation of the war in Vietnam, right? So, this war in Vietnam is going to end up being a complete and utter catastrophe. And it's a war that was unnecessary, that is going to cost the Americans, 58,000 American lives, that is going to cost about over a million Vietnamese lives, billions of dollars. It's going to be a complete disaster, guys, for a war that we're going to end up losing, right? And, you know, there's no other way to explain this other than Lyndon B. Johnson will be the responsible for this. And so from 1955 all the way to 1963, the US was involved in a very limited way in the war in Vietnam, all right? It was some economic aid and about 16,000 advisors, supporting the South Vietnamese, right? By 1965, when we have this Gulf of Tonkin incident and this involvement of the Americans in the Vietnam War, that is going to be elevated to about 500,000 American troops on the ground. All right, so this is a war that was completely unnecessary, and particularly when you understand the motives behind the escalation of the war, right? And I'm talking about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident is basically two separate attacks on August of 1964, in which two Navy ships are going to be attacked by what was believed to be North Vietnamese troops. All right, so this incident is going to be the justification for what are called the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions, right? Which basically, in a long story short kind of way, are going to give President Johnson a blank check to escalate the war in Vietnam without actually declaring war on Vietnam, right? So The problematic part with all this is that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, I don't want to say it didn't happen, but it became very clear that either the people were deceived into thinking that it happened or that it was grossly exaggerated to justify and escalate the involvement in the war in Vietnam, right? So Lyndon B. Johnson was very aware of this. And eventually, when the Pentagon Papers are released in 1975, we come to the realization that the American public has been deceived from the beginning, all right? Johnson was very aware that the Gulf of Tonkin incident may or may not have happened, but still justified it to escalate the war in Vietnam. Uh, the public had been deceived into believing the war was going to be won, but it became very clear from a very early point that this may be a non-winnable war, but the public kept getting lied to, and still they continue to escalate the war in Vietnam, causing a disaster, guys. Everything that I mentioned earlier, 58,000 American lives, a million Vietnamese lives, some things that could be considered crimes against humanity. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped more bombs in Vietnam that we dropped in the entirety of World War II. It is a humanitarian crisis. And, once again, there is no other way that we can explain the war of Vietnam without putting Lyndon B. Johnson at fault. All right, so this is the duality of the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, right? Because at the end of the day, this war in Vietnam is going to be not just because we lose the war, right? But the American government is going to lose the trust of the people. The way I like to think about this is that I find myself to be highly distrustful of the government. And in a lot of ways, it's because of the war in Vietnam. It's because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's because of the Pentagon Papers. It is because during this time, the American government proved itself to be highly unreliable, that you cannot trust the government to be honest with the people and to be acting on the best interest of the people, right? And in a lot of ways, this is the responsibility of the war of Vietnam. And it is something that, again, would not have happened without the escalation of Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, I'm very aware that Lyndon B. Johnson left office in 1968 and the American participation in the war in Vietnam continued until 1973. But Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the war to such a proportion that it was very difficult to just leave the war after Lyndon B. Johnson also left office, right? So, I know at the beginning I mentioned that I have a soft spot for Lyndon B. Johnson, and I do. And I'm very appreciative of some of the, policies that shape modern America and that I'm a personal beneficiary of them. But at the same time, it is very difficult to have a soft spot for such a catastrophic event for the history of the U.S. like the war in Vietnam. I believe was a huge mistake. The escalation was completely unnecessary, and the way it was handled, it was even worse. All right. So, anyways, yeah, let me know what you think. I know Lyndon B. Johnson is a polarizing figure. Again, some people have him ranked really high on the list of presidents. Some people have him ranked very low on the list of presidents. So I always find it interesting to hear the opinions on the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. So let me know what you think. I'll be around and be safe. Okay? See y'all.